American media is proud to present Cataclysm from Space, 2800 BC, an illustrated lecture by Donald W. Patten. In our opinion, this presentation contains one of the most startling and important scientific concepts of the 20th century. In a moment, you'll examine evidence that less than 5,000 years ago, a stray planet from deep space nearly collided with Earth. You'll contemplate gigantic gravitational forces, a flexing of the Earth's crust, volcanic ruptures everywhere, entire mountain ranges suddenly thrusting skyward with immeasurable force, and oceanic tides that easily could have risen over 5,000 feet. You'll begin to understand that the biblical story of a worldwide flood in the time of Noah, far from being an impossible myth, is an accurate historical account of an event that really happened, an event that can only be described as Cataclysm from Space, 2800 BC. Donald Patten, our speaker, his wife Lorraine, and their 7 children reside in Seattle, Washington, where he's the owner of a successful microfilming business. But Mr. Patten is a geographer by training, having received his master's degree in geography from the University of Washington. His interest and knowledge are not limited to geography, however, for he is a scholar in other fields as well: ancient history, ancient literature, climatology, genetics, geology, zoology, and philosophy. Mr. Patten does not rely entirely on his own research. He is the first to explain that he leans heavily on the findings and advice of others proficient in their respective fields. His office has been the scene of countless conferences with scientists in the fields of physics, astronomy, biology, geomorphology, and oceanography. In 1966, after almost 7 years of intensive research, Mr. Patten published his first book, The Biblical Flood and the Ice Epoch. Literally, it has stunned the scientific and academic worlds, for he is challenging the dogma now taught in almost all the nation's high schools and colleges. In this textbook, for instance, entitled Essentials of Earth History, published by Prentice Hall, the unsuspecting student is subjected to an anti-religious bias that's both subtle and effective. On page 31, it says, "In ancient times, men saw the natural world as a product of supernatural events, or as the work of powerful gods. Creation myths abound which depict the beginning of things in supernatural or miraculous ways. The concept of a single short period of creation requires, or at least favors, what is called catastrophism. Believers in catastrophism see the earth as having been affected by universal world-shaking events, surpassing in violence anything known in modern time. The greatest of all past catastrophes described in the Bible with any detail is Noah's flood, or the deluge. The doctrine of catastrophism, in addition to being a traditional belief among the unlearned and superstitious, was supported by many of the best minds of the 18th century. One of the chief supporters of the theory was the French Baron Georges Cuvier, who was, among other things, an able anatomist and a student of geology. The Church was happy to have the support of such an eminent scientist, and there's no doubt that Cuvier's great reputation delayed the acceptance of more reasonable views that ultimately prevailed. The idea that catastrophism might be wrong may have arisen in some minds as a reaction against theological dogmatism. But to most it was an outgrowth of the actual observation of nature. The concept of uniformitarianism, meaning that the earth has come about by uniform, gradual processes, is opposed to catastrophism. Perhaps the best expression of what geologists mean by uniformitarianism is still the time-worn saying, "The present is the key to the past." Now, ladies and gentlemen, if Donald Patten is right, then this and hundreds of other school textbooks on geology and earth history are wrong. If Donald Patten is right, then many of those who have scoffed at the Bible as merely ancient mythology themselves have been perpetuating the greatest myth of all history. The following presentation was delivered and recorded at a convention of the New England Rally for God, Family, and Country, held in Boston on the 4th of July, 1970. You will hear it and see it as it occurred. And so it is with great pleasure now that we present Mr. Donald W. Patten.
We're going to have a series of 106 slides. We're going to be moving fairly rapidly. We're going to be hitting a panorama of subjects, and I want to introduce this subject by a little bit of background thinking. Back about 1700, a man named Newton began to understand the nature of gravity and published on it, and the Western world was very much taken up. The planets were orbiting in stable orbits, predictable orbits, and had been for an unknown length of time. People were trying to explain the origin of the solar system. In about 1730, in Sweden, there was a man who ventured a new theory on the origin of the solar system, and it's called the nebular hypothesis. This man said the solar system was once a vast nebula, gaseous filament, and it began to condense due to the gravitational attraction. Most of it condensed into the sun, but a little bit did not, and they formed globules which cooled off and formed the planets. This was 5 billion years ago in his thinking. This man's name was Emanuel Swedenborg. And after proposing the nebular hypothesis, he added that he himself had had seances with men on Jupiter, Saturn, and other parts more distant. Many considered him to be insane. About 20 years later, a German went to Sweden to teach. He was in his early 20s. His name was Immanuel Kant. Kant was raised in a pious Lutheran home, and he had rejected the Christian faith. He was looking for explanations which would constantly overthrow the Scriptures. He was a mathematician and a geographer. He read Swedenborg's hypothesis. Perhaps he met him personally. He decided to throw out the seance bit and keep the rest and call it science. And so the nebular hypothesis was born. It was published when Kant was 31 years old in 1755 in Germany. Now this is the theory which supposedly requires a nebulous 5 billion years for the origin of the solar system. A friend of mine in Seattle named Hatch, who is involved in the space navigation program, and myself are analyzing the nebular hypothesis. We already have 168 conditions in the solar system which defy this approach. Kant proceeded to divorce himself from his native fields of geography and mathematics, and he went into philosophy, and he became the George Washington of classical German philosophy, which we call rationalism. He founded what we call higher criticism. He said there could have been no long day of Joshua when the sun wandered crazily in the sky, and he didn't say why, but he assumed there could not because the nebular hypothesis had no room for such a thought. Then he said similar things about the flood. He says it was impossible because rain couldn't cause such an event as this. Preliminary conclusion and an immature conclusion. And he inveighed heavily against every historical proposition in the Bible, and he did so not in the rags of prejudice, but in the mantle or in the cloak of science or intellectualism. Kant's theory was accepted as if it were science in the scientific realm, and a generation later, millions of years, and gradualism was instituted in geology by a man named Patten. Hutton said that the present is the key to the past, millions of years of gradualism. Another generation later, Lyell took Hutton's ideas and he made them popular. And then one generation further, Lyell's associate, Darwin, made this popular in biology. Kant taught Hegel, Kant taught Feuerbach, and Nietzsche. And some of these men taught Marx. Now they have sold this idea of millions of years in gradualism for Earth history, and in doing so, they have said that the Bible is anti-scientific. Well, let's let them say that. Then let's look under the trappings of what they conclude. Let's examine their assumptions. Let's look at the crust of the earth. Let's see what it teaches us, and then make our own conclusions. Now we're going to talk about what we will title evolutionary uniformitarianism. This is the idea of vast millions of years of sereneness in Earth history. And I'm going to suggest that this approach, which is almost universally adopted in the schools of our land, is myth. It is not a lie because too many people sincerely accept it. After all, you're supposed to believe what the teacher says. So they accept it. They've never heard the other side. So this becomes not a lie, but a myth. We're going to just examine a few things about the flood. I had an interesting experience. This is just a side, but I turned around the script which my college professors wrote in college. I came to college with no faith. A young fellow across the hall, who had been a rear gunner and a dive bomber in World War II, gave me the first New Testament I ever read. I had also studied geography since I was a child. I had immersed my mind in maps. And as I read the Genesis record, I said to myself, how in the world could rain float a boat as big as the ark? I didn't think it would happen. But if it would happen, I had a few questions. How come the ark floated uphill? Secondly, how come it says the waters rose for 150 days, and yet it says it only rained for 40 days? That's 110 days of rising waters, but no rainfall. And then it dawned in my geographical mind. In geography, we have what is called a cause and effect relationship, but we also have what we call our associative relationships. Corn and pumpkins both mature at the same time, but one does not cause the other. They're merely associated. And I asked myself, here can we program in our minds that rain is associated with a flood but is not the cause of it? Now we're going to just look at a little bit of fossil evidence, and then we're going to ask ourselves if tides might very well be the true explanation of the flood. Here are some clams near Cleburne, Texas. In this layer of clams, there are millions of them. Clams have shells that are held together by a muscle. When the clam dies, the shells fall apart because the muscle relaxes and deteriorates. These clams are found intact, which means they were not only buried suddenly and were buried by the million, but were buried alive. And this is 700 or 800 feet above sea level and about 500 miles from the Gulf of Mexico. And here we find fossilized worms. This would have to be very sudden because worms deteriorate so fast. And notice the structure within the worms is just perfect, which suggests such a sudden burial and then compression, and then chemical exchange. For these are now rocks. Now we're going to Nebraska. Somewhere between Nebraska and North Dakota is the center of the North American continent. This is to say, this is as far from an ocean as you can get. And here we find not 10,000 bones, but the remains of 10,000 animals, 2,000 feet above sea level. And I'm going to toss out a little reflective question. How much water would be required to bring in the carcasses of 10,000 animals 2,000 feet above sea level. Now, there's a further question. These bones are shredded. It is as if we had a million-piece puzzle and we mixed the pieces all up and spilled them out on the floor. Because here are, if not a million bones, hundreds of thousands of bones. And the carcasses are not intact, but they're shredded. And what is going to be the velocity of the water that would shred carcasses like this? If we're talking about tides of subcontinental proportions, as long as the Earth rotates at a speed of 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, we're talking about tides that could be thousands of feet deep and hundreds of miles per hour. These are crinoids. These are animals that live below sea level, sometimes 5,000 feet below, rarely shallower than 500 feet below sea level, scattered across the American Midwest. I'm going to suggest shortly that the flood was tidal in nature, and if it was tidal in nature, we're having minus tides as well as plus tides. The oceans are emptying out as well as the continents being washed or covered. There is no such thing as mean sea level in such a catastrophe as I envision. In other words, I'm saying the ocean bottoms and the debris therein were washed out and were scattered so broadly as the heartland of America, Iowa in this case. Now look at a very puzzling circumstance. Here is where the ark landed in these mountain uplifts. The ark landed in what is called the mountains of Ararat, what geographers call eastern Turkey the Armenian knot of mountains, and some of these mountains are 15,000 feet high. There are basins in these mountains. Lake Van is an example, or Lake Savan, or Lake Gotchka, and even these basins are 5,000 and 6,000 feet above sea level, which suggests that the ark landed at least 10,000 feet above sea level. I'm not going to suggest that the ark landed here because of the high tide of waters, but it's a part of the understanding. Now we're going to examine a verse of Scripture. This is chapter 7, verse 11 in Genesis. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Now, where it says the windows of heaven were opened, this is my understanding that there was a torrential rain. But also, notice it says the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up. And the suggestion here, the fountains of the great deep, seem to be the oceans. Now, somebody may say, well, this is impossible. The only thing possible are tides of 30 or 40 feet like you have on the Bay of Fundy. Tides of 500 or 5,000 or 50,000 feet are possible. It merely depends on what I will introduce a new term here, what we call the gravity gradient. Now the gravity gradient for the Earth, there are two variables. One is the moon and the other is the sun. And these cause the current Earth tides. But if a planet came suddenly within the Earth-Moon system, then we would have great tides suddenly, and those tides would be reflective on how large that body was, plus how close it came. I'm going to suggest very suddenly that there was a change in the Earth's gravity gradient. There is a law in astronomy called Roche's limit. And here we're dealing with bodies that are above 200 miles in diameter. And if they happen to be on a collision course, they will not collide, because a smaller one will fragment before they collide because the gravity that holds it together will be overcome. It's called Roche's limit, and it's 2.44 times the radius of the larger planet. If Mercury came 10,000 miles from the Earth, it would fragment. If it came 11,000 miles from the Earth would have tides of 30,000 feet, and Mercury would have tides of 800,000 feet. So I'm just saying high tides are not impossible. It merely depends on the gravity gradient. Now we're going to look out in the solar system and see if there have been examples of sudden changes in gravity gradient. We're going to look at Halley's Comet, and here you see it. Halley's Comet orbits around the Sun and goes around and has its other focal point in the region of Neptune's orbit. Halley's Comet also revolves clockwise. The planets revolve counterclockwise. There are a few rocks of Jupiter, which are apparently asteroids that have been captured, that revolve clockwise. Halley's Comet revolves clockwise, and there you see where it goes out to Neptune's region. And here are Neptune's two moons, Triton, the inner one, and Nereid, the outer one, and both of these revolve clockwise, and this is very suspicious. Notice the high eccentricity of Nereid, as if Neptune almost lost it. Compare that to the eccentricity of Halley's Comet. Now we're going to look at an interesting situation. As we're looking down from Polaris, we're looking at the orbits of the planets. If I ask the audience, what is the outermost planet? Every one of you, I venture to say, would say Pluto. And if I were a college instructor, I would give you either half credit or no credit for that answer, because it is not sufficiently qualified. Once every 248 years, for a period of about 20 years, Pluto comes inside Neptune's orbit. What we call its perihelion is closer to the Sun than either Neptune's perihelion or Neptune's aphelion. Astronomers have often said that little Pluto came in, got wrapped up in Neptune's gravitational field, and its orbit was thrown gollywampus. Now, I'm suggesting to you that this did happen, but it was more complex than that, because you have seen the odd directions in the revolution of its two moons, and you've seen Halley's Comet, and I think that perhaps Pluto came in with 2 or 3 satellites, and these satellites also were thrown into a gollywampus orbit. And some of them were captured by Neptune, and some, like Halley's Comet, continued to orbit around the Sun, came back to Neptune, and it wasn't there. Now we're going to come into 1 billion miles. Saturn and its rings. These rings of Saturn are within Roche's limit, 2.44 times the radius of the larger. And it is quite apparent and widely concluded that a little body came too close to Saturn. Now, in the case of Pluto, a planet apparently got involved with the Neptune gravitational domain, and its orbit was radically changed or perturbed. And that is one order of gravity gradient. Here is a higher order of gravity gradient, one which destroys an astronomical body, which tears it to pieces. Now we're going to come in a little closer. Between Mars and Jupiter are the asteroids, which, by the consensus of a great many people, astronomers, space navigation people, are battered fragments of a former planet. This is Mars, showing its seasons. Mars has a very, very little atmosphere and is extremely hostile to life. Recent Mariner probe buzzed Mars and sent back some pictures. Told us that Mars is indeed cratered up. There are craters within craters within craters on Mars. And here is our Scarface satellite. And here's the backside of the moon, which has never been seen until the last decade. Now you see, evolutionary uniformitarianism says millions and billions of years of unending sereneness. And this does not seem to say sereneness. Now we're going to just suggest something on orogeny. Orogeny is mountain building. I've already just touched on tides of water, and you saw the fossil evidences. We're going to talk about tides in the magma, or tides of lava. Now today, the Earth is a little bit oblate. It is thicker by about 26 or 27 miles in its equatorial diameter versus its polar diameter, and this is because of a compromise between gravity and centrifugal force. I'm going to suggest that force number 3 suddenly interrupted. And this caused tides in the oceans, this caused tides in the magma, and it also caused tides in the fluid atmosphere. In other words, I'm saying the Earth is a triple fluid. Now, notice that the thin crust of the Earth, we call it thick, but I would venture to say that an ant on an eggshell would call an eggshell thick. Our thin crust is only 5 to 30 miles thick, and this is about as thin as an onion skin to an onion. And if we're having tides of the dimension that I propose, we're having this thin crust being tortured on top by overriding waters and below from upwelling tides of lava or magma. And it is in a bellows-like activity. Now we're going to look at the pattern of mountain uplifts on our planet, and it is a surprising pattern. If you examine this map in detail, you will see that the South Pole is at the very bottom of the map and the South Pole is at the very top. This is what we call a cartographer's delight. And we look at the pattern of mountain uplifts and we find that they take a great circle pattern. This is exactly what we would anticipate if the Earth were writhing in terms of great internal tides of lava or magma. And these internal tides of magma were pulled up and deformed the Earth's thin skin. You can see we're plotting the centers of the arcs, and there are 2 of them. Now, it is my belief that the first arc occurred during the first part of the flood, the vertical one, which you see, which includes the Andes, the Rockies, and the Kuril Islands, the Ryukyus, over through Japan. And the second cycle, it is my understanding, is the uplift during the time of the end of the flood. This includes the Alps, the Himalayas, and so forth. Here you see the parallelism of the echelon in Eastern Asia, the Japanese arc, the Kuril arc, the Ryukyu arc, and so forth. And here you see the mountains draping or swirling across Eastern Asia. So the mountain arcs are swung around the Earth. And here are some of the mountains on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington. Now notice, going back into the distance, the wave-like pattern of the mountains. The evolutionary theory says millions and billions of years. These mountains may be 65 million years old, one range, and the range right behind it, 85 million. And they're saying each one of these ranges comes up independently in any given million of years. When I was 18 years old, I stood on top of the Cabinet Divide in Montana working in the Forest Service, and I saw this wave and trough-like pattern of mountains going off 100 miles into Idaho and 200 miles into Montana. And I told myself, Bible or no Bible, that theory of mountain systems is impossible. As a matter of fact, I was debating with a geologist out in Seattle, and I said, these mountains are obviously the result of an astronomical catastrophe. Now, this man was thinking in the wrong vein. He was worried about my dating these fossils so recently. So he said, yes, I can see that the mountains are a result of an astronomical catastrophe, but couldn't that be 25 million years ago? You see, he acknowledged what he thought was my minor premise to establish what he thought was his major premise. I know a little bit about the evolutionary theories of mountain systems, and the theories are vague. Some of them say convection currents in the lava. Some of them say crustal contraction or continental drift. They're all vague, but they all say that the mountain systems, whatever their cause, is from down that way. And if I'm right, the cause of mountain systems is from that way. Somebody is wrong, and somebody is 180 degrees wrong. Also, evolutionary geology says that these patterns are roughly 150 million years ago, and I'm saying not all mountains, but these mountains are 5,000 years ago. And people, somebody is 99.996% wrong on timing. They're 99.99% wrong in scope. If this catastrophic theory of mountain building is correct, and this is a mouthful to any of you publishers in the audience, 500 textbooks in geology need to be rewritten. You understand? Now, this is Mercury. Now, Mercury is the smallest of the planets, and it is the leading candidate in my mind. And Mars is the second leading possibility. They're the only two possibilities that caused the flood. Probably Mercury. And if Mercury came 20,000 miles from the Earth would have tides of 5,000 feet. Mercury would have tides of over 100,000 feet. There you can get a little bit of a picture of what could happen under a catastrophic solar system and a suddenly changed gravity gradient. I'm suggesting that this body came around the Earth, came about 20,000 miles from the Earth. I think it had a little satellite that came 10,000 miles from the Earth, and we'll see this shortly, a little icy satellite, and that icy satellite actually fragmented. And this body came around, went out to about 1.8 million miles, and came back about 4 to 4.5 months later, and then this body, instead of going out, as it would have had it turned on the Earth but once, the Earth has turned 120 degrees relative to the Sun, and this body is not going out but into the Sun and into a new inner orbit. Now we're going to look at a little bit more in terms of fossils. Here we're going back to Texas. Here's where you find a dinosaur walking right across. This is the Paluxy River. You see, the Paluxy River has eroded all the soft materials out, and now they're down to the hard layer that is the pre-flood layer, or the layer that was caused at the time of the flood. And here's the right and the left, the right and the left, and so on and so forth. In one place we find human footprints and dinosaur footprints crossing. Now here are human footprints found in here's a dinosaur footprint, and here's a badly eroded human footprint. And here, coming from the same place, again my projectionist, who is a geologist, he found this footprint larger than the average human footprint today. And this is in rocks that are supposed to be 70 million years old. Now, this is awfully hard on the evolutionary theory of timing. Now, this is a man named Meister from Kearns, Utah, William Meister, and he makes bolo ties as a hobby. He's a rock hound. And he was splitting some mid-Cambrian rock, mid-Cambrian shale. Mid-Cambrian shale is dated by the evolutionary system at 550 million years ago. And he found in this shale some trilobites. Now, trilobites are the earliest animal the evolutionist acknowledges, and man is the latest. But Meister found something that was very surprising. These trilobites, in strata 550 million years ago, had been crushed by human footprints. There's even wear on the sandal print, if you could see the whole thing, by the latest animal in the evolutionary picture. How do you figure that? Here again, we have the trilobites, and there's wear on the sandal imprint on the heel right here. 549 millions of years are mythical and more. Now this is a geologic time column. I want you to all have this in your frontal lobes. This is a myth. Evolution says the Cambrian was 550 million years ago, and here's where we find the human footprints. They say that man appeared on the scene during the Pleistocene. Evolution tells us that dinosaurs died out for some reason or other 60 million years ago. Man came on the scene 1 million years ago. So with those human footprints, side by side to dinosaur footprints, we have 59 million years, which the evolutionist is uneasy about. A man named Louis Agassiz, about 1845 or 50, he was a Swiss naturalist, and he had climbed a lot of mountains in Switzerland, and he noticed the evidences of glaciation, and he said Europe at one time must have been covered by a vast blanket of ice, a blanket covering everything north of Switzerland to Norway. And he proved his point. Lyell immediately announced that the Ice Age was a recent event. It was 1 million years ago. Now, some Yankee got the idea in his mind that this timing of the Ice Age could be checked out. Niagara Falls, there is escarpment over which Niagara River flows. And it flows over a hard sandstone, and underneath this is a softer limestone, and the river erodes it out and cuts back. It was understood that the Great Lakes, like Lake Erie and Lake Huron and Lake Ontario, were results of the melting of the ice. At the end of the Ice Age, they were formed. This Yankee said, you know, we can measure the distance the escarpment has retreated. We get the annual rate of retreat, the distance. We go to 4th grade arithmetic, and we can find out how long ago the Ice Age was. And so they asked Lyell to come over and check it out, and he asked the natives how fast this falls was retreating. They said it was retreating about 5 feet a year. He did his arithmetic, and he said, this means this is 10,000 years ago. This is impossible. He said, we're going to have to assume that these Yankees are exaggerating. And so he reasoned we will allow 16 inches a year. And on the basis of his new mathematics, he announced to the world, without blinking an eyelash, presto changeo, that the Ice Age is 40,000 years ago. People, it is not only politicians that play around with zeros with gay abandon. Lyell admitted a 96% error, and he considered himself a scientist, or he considered this to be somewhere within the realm of science. I don't know. But the story is even more interesting. The Yankees were not exaggerating when they said 5 feet a year. They were being conservative. 6 feet a year. This means we're down to 10,000 years if we assume a steady water flow, but we know that the water flow used to be much greater, and so we're down to 5,000 years ago. Now, I've introduced the subject of the Ice Age in terms of timing. In 1958, near Little America, the government sponsored a drilling in the ice cap to see how deep the ice was, and the team thought it would be 2,000 or 3,000 feet deep. They took plenty of casing, which was fortunate. And they drilled and drilled and drilled. They got down to 4,000 and 5,000 feet, and it was still ice. And they were puzzled. This was sea level. 6,000 feet, and it was still ice. 7,000 feet, still ice. 8,000 feet, it was still ice. 9,000 feet, 10,000 feet. 10,000 feet, 500, and they hit bedrock, and it was ice all the way. People, there is ice today 5,000 and 5,500 feet below sea level. I'm going to show you shortly that this ice dump is part of the flood catastrophe and is over the magnetic poles. In Siberia, some strange creatures have been found encased in ice. Baron Tall on the New Siberian Islands found quick-frozen mammoths. He found quick-frozen mammoths surrounded by subtropical vegetation, elderberries, bushes with ripe elderberries. Now, the artist has given these animals a snowy background, but these animals needed 600 pounds or more of vegetation per day in order to just call it 3 square meals. And it was a subtropical, lush background in which they lived. They're found suddenly frozen. This is a Beresovka mammoth. In his digestive system are found subtropical sedges, buttercups, bluebells, grasses. Not only that, but in his mouth, half masticated, are found unswallowed breakfast. It is as if this animal died so fast that he did not have a chance to swallow his last bite. Here's some mammoth ivory, which is much bigger than current African or Indian elephant ivory. 20,000 tusks were taken out of one mine in Siberia alone, which gives you an idea of how many mammoths must have been entombed suddenly. Some places entombed by water and other places entombed by ice. Now, I asked, when I was in college, I wanted an explanation. One of my professors said, well, maybe this mammoth walked around on a lake, and maybe he got too far out, and maybe he fell through. And I said, if that were true, and he fell through into water, his carcass would deteriorate unless the fish scavenged it first. It would just rot. And he said, well, maybe through some miracle that didn't happen this time. Well, I said, if that were the case, how come he had subtropical vegetation in his stomach? So help me, he said, maybe he walked a long ways. And then I asked him, well, if that were the case, how come there are evidences of millions of them? And he said, well, there were millions of years, weren't there? And about this time, I didn't know whether to tear my hair out or to shut up. I'm just saying there are problems. Some of this mammoth meat has fallen into the hands of the bird's eye frozen food people, and they say that they can tell something about the temperatures of the cooler in which a carcass is thrown. Bird's eye frozen food scientists have said these animals died so suddenly that they must have been incarcerated at temperatures below 150 degrees below zero. So what caused the quick freezing of the mammoths? Now, scientists have said it is impossible to quick freeze a mammoth. Analyze that statement. He is saying so in the garb of science because he is a scientist. And he is implying under normal conditions. Well, who's talking about normal conditions? You see, I'm saying that his worldview is limited to the uniformitarian assumption that the present is the key to the past, and it is not. Now, this is a Yakut. This man's ancestors rode with Genghis Khan. And they have stories about what caused the quick freezing of the mammoths. They don't think it's really all that difficult to explain. They say that mammoths live underneath the crust of the earth like moles. Every time there's an earthquake, there's merely a herd of mammoths thundering around underneath the crust of the earth. And they say that every time a mammoth surfaces and sees sunlight, immediately he dies. And my question is, who has a better explanation, the evolutionist or the Yakut? Science can explain a quick frozen mammoth. You and I could quick freeze a mammoth if we took a mammoth out beside a swimming pool filled with liquid nitrogen or liquid oxygen and pushed him off. It is not impossible to quick freeze a mammoth. What we need to do is program our minds toward catastrophism, and this means ridding it of the evolutionary uniformitarian hypothesis of Earth history. Now, we'll take further thoughts on the Ice Age. The Ice Age was in the northern hemisphere was 3 miles thick here, and it feathered out toward the edges. The Alleghenies are down here. The ice flowed out not only around them but over them. Now, I know in Washington today we have glaciers caused by slow snow development, like on Mount Rainier. And here, just like rivers, the flowing glaciers always avoid the hills and go down the valleys. But here is ice which flowed over hill and valley alike, and some of these hills were 5,000 feet high, the Adirondacks. I'm suggesting this can only happen when there is a quick deposition and a quick outflow. Now, one other thing, notice how Siberia was not hit and Alaska was. This ice age was centered closer to the magnetic pole than to the North Pole. Actually, the center of it was in northern Greenland. I found out a surprising thing recently, that the radiation belts, the Van Allen belts, are not centered over the North Pole. They are over the magnetic pole, as I had assumed. They are centered right over there. I'm going to show you how I think the ice came to our little planet. Here is the Van Allen belts. And if we have ice particles revolving around the Earth, these ice particles are going to pick up an electrical charge from the shortwave radiation of the sun, set up a microfield, and will be deflected over the magnetic regions in orbit, where they will tend to collide, decelerate, descend, and fall. Now, it is my belief that something like 40 days and 40 nights are required for this ice dump. We're going to ask ourselves the source of the ice. This is Jupiter, and here's Callisto, 800 miles in diameter, considered to be pure ice. An illustration that extremely cold ice does exist in our solar system. Uranus and Saturn also have moons of part ice or completely ice. This is Ganymede, which is half ice and half rock. And here is Saturn, the rings of Saturn, which you've already seen. The interesting thing is, 20 years ago, these were measured in their thinness. They're less than 10 miles thick. They're quite reflective, and it was realized that these are not rock fragments like the asteroids. Here are ice particles. Here we have an evidence of an icy catastrophe in our solar system, and it may be a model for our own Earth's ice age. Here is the pattern of the ice dump and the Van Allen belts, and the ice is coming in over the magnetic poles and coming in very suddenly, and if its source is the extreme portions of our solar system, this ice is 200 and 300 degrees below zero, and this is reflected in the quick freezing of the mammoths. The Bible says before the flood that the earth had a different climate. The Snohomish Indians say in the ancient times that there was a time when the sky hung low and there was no thunder and lightning. The Bible says before the flood that the earth was watered by dew at night and there was no rain. And it suggests there was a canopy. God made a firmament, the atmosphere, and divided the waters which were under the firmament, this is the oceans, from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. Now this we believe to be is a canopy that the earth had before the flood. This is the canopy that Venus has today. Below this there's a temperature equilibrium and no winds. It's called the greenhouse effect of Venus. If there are no winds, there are no rains. And if there's a temperature equilibrium, there's no winds. It's my belief that before the flood, the earth had an atmosphere in which there was a low-level, unbroken cloud canopy, and I think it was 5,000 to 10,000 feet above the earth's surface. There was a high-level ozone canopy and a thicker carbon dioxide mixture, not that thick, but a thicker one. Both the canopy and the carbon dioxide will cause the absorption of long-wave radiation, and the ozone canopy will tend to absorb the short-wave radiation. This is the lethal radiation. And we have a greenhouse effect from pole to pole. Now, does it surprise you people if Admiral Byrd found a petrified forest 100 miles from the South Pole in 1933? The climate of the earth was different at one time. Now, ozone today is concentrated up in our ionosphere, and because of our planetary wind systems, it fluxes down. You and I today breathe in ozone in parts of 2 or 3 parts per 100 million. We're finding today that ozone is a very, very toxic gas. Ozone, which is O3, reacts with the hemoglobin, it reacts with the lipids, and in the lipids it forms a chain reaction, a domino type reaction among the molecules in the human system. When a person is put in under ozone experimentation, not only do white blood cells rush to the lungs, but the whole physiology reacts, and one of the effects of ozone poisoning is aging. Medical doctors who are radiologists never get in front of the X-ray equipment, but the X-ray equipment creates some ozone, and they work in this atmosphere 30 or 40 hours a week, and the average radiologist lives 7 years shorter than the average MD. And I believe it's due to ozone. I'm saying this ozone did not flux down before the flood, and this is a major aging cause. Now here is a diagram of the change, as a biblical record records, the change in the longevity of man. 900 years, and it comes down to 70 in what we call a transient decay curve. A man named Fettner in 1961 reported in Nature magazine that he had subjected to fish to water, oxygenated, but the oxygen was mixed with ozone, and he found a similar curve of declining longevity. Now, I'm suggesting that this is one of 2 possible factors, the other being a change in level of carbon dioxide, which caused this change in longevity. And also, this is the reason why animals were larger before the flood. They didn't mature as fast. Now, we go into Geology 101, and we get into about Chapter 2, and here we have all these 18-year-old, 19-year-old students, and we have a proposition like this presented. Homo diluvia testis, he who witnessed the flood. This fossil of a giant salamander was declared by Johann Schutzer in 1726 to be the remains of a miserable sinner who perished in the deluge. Now, a kid is supposed to read this. He is supposed to laugh with mockery and go back and tell his parent that the Bible is against science. Notice that this is a giant salamander, and giant animals before the flood were the norm. This is a half-truth. My experience is, when I lecture in the state of Washington, that students have never heard the other side. And once they realize there is another side, it's like a breath of fresh air. Does this interest any basketball coaches? Now, I cannot say that I cannot absolutely verify for these human footprints. In the Paluxy River of Texas in the 1930s, farmers there dug many of these out, not under conditions of geological inspection, and they sold them. And these were sold. These were bought by a man named Burdick. And I cannot vouch because they were not seen in situ. But Steve, my projectionist, has seen other human footprints, 2 of which we've already shown you in situ in Cretaceous rock, supposedly 70 million years ago. The Bible says there were giants on the earth in those days, and I'm wondering if it means giant animals, giant man, giant insects, giant birds, or all. Now we're going back to the flood account for another cue. The 600th year of Noah's life, here it talks about longevity, you see. In the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month. Now here is the windows of heaven were opened, and this is when, with the ice particles coming in, suddenly the pre-flood canopy disappeared as the sudden nuclei of condensation wiped it out. And I think another translation is fair to say, blue sky was seen. Now we're not talking about the grandeur of creation, the magnificence of the biological structures, but I will say this. A man named Kaplan in Philadelphia has studied mutations, and he studies statistics, and he says the requirements of evolution via mutations are about 100 magnitudes beyond possibility. David Heiser, another zoologist, says 100,000 favorable mutations are required to create a species. Not one mutation in 1,000 is favorable. And to get 100,000 favorable mutations in one species, we have to take a number that takes 1,500 pages to write the zeros in. And we can write the number of electrons in the universe on 2 lines of a typewriter. Our evolutionists like to talk about chance. Well, let's just make them talk about chance and the ludicrous dimensions of what they choose to base their case on. But we're not talking about biology here. We're talking about catastrophism. Now we're ready to close. Uniformitarianism, the doctrine that existing processes acting as at present are sufficient to account for all geological changes. Uniformitarianism has a motto: the present is the key of the past. This is a doctrine of atheism. This is a doctrine of humanism. This is the doctrine of Kant. This is the doctrine of Lyell. This is the doctrine of communism. This is the doctrine of evolution. Catastrophism, the doctrine that changes in the Earth's crust have generally been effected suddenly by physical forces. This is the biblical doctrine, and this, I am saying, is the scientific doctrine. Thank you.